One human race, the story of us, and the story of the color of our skin. Why can't we get along? Where does white skin come from? An interview with Dr. Sarah Tishkoff.
Dr. Sarah Tishkoff is the David and Lynn Silfen University Professor of Genetics and Biology at University of Pennsylvania, Director of the Penn Center for Global Genomics and Health Equity, holds appointments in the School of Medicine and the School of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Tishkoff studies genetics and phenotypic variation in ethnically diverse Africans. Her research uses science to examine African population history and how genetic variation can affect a wide range of traits, including how they adapt through evolution. Am I right that what you're saying is that the evolutionary, not the evolutionary, the variants in the genes that are expressing or that have to do with skin pigmentation were already in the genome of the Homo sapiens?
Well, that is true for some of the genes and some of the variants. So we know that some genetic variants that play a role in, say, light skin color in Europeans arose relatively recently. Could have been in the past 10,000 years, for example. But because we focused on Africa, which has been greatly underrepresented in human genetic studies. This is why my entire career has been spent trying to build up knowledge about African genetic diversity and population history and adaptation. And what a lot of people didn't realize is that there is a lot of variation for skin color or skin pigmentation across within and between African populations. And this is not due to, say, marriage, or in population genetics, we say admixture between people from outside of Africa and people in Africa. This is naturally occurring variation that over tens of thousands of years, probably due to natural selection, adaptation to different environments. And we knew that skin color is a great example of an adaptive trait, because the darker skin pigmentation really correlates remarkably well with UV levels. So the more UV, the closer to the equator you are, the more you're going to see people with darkly pigmented skin. But what some people might not realize is that it's not just Africans, and it's not all Africans, some subset of Africans who have very dark skin. But we see this in South Asia. We see it in Australo-Melanesia. Again, it's thought that this is adaptive to being in regions with a high level of sunlight, of UV exposure. And the idea was that when our ancestors, well, I should say first that all modern humans originated in Africa. That we know within the past 300,000 years. And relatively recently, in the past, say, 50 to 80,000 years, which is not a lot in the big scheme of evolution, that's a pretty short time period, that relatively small numbers of people migrated out of Africa across the rest of the globe. And some of these migration events were pretty recent. For example, migration into some of the Pacific Islands. Migration into the Americas likely occurred somewhere between 15,000 to 30,000 years ago. So it was thought that when our ancestors left Africa and went to higher latitudes, so regions with less UV, that there would be selection for lighter skin. The hypothesis has been that this is because vitamin D is actually very important for proper development function of the body. If you don't have enough vitamin D, you can get sick, and that's why milk in the US is fortified often with vitamin D. Right. But vitamin D is actually synthesized in the skin in response to UV. So if you don't have a lot of UV, perhaps you're not going to have enough vitamin D. But I will say that this is, like many things in evolution, what we call an adaptation story that we don't. And in fact, when I was in Africa returning results and talking to communities, one of the things they would ask me is, are albinos more closely related to me? Are they like my brother and sister? And I said, no, they're more like you. There's only one little change, out of 3 billion nucleotides, we call it letters, that make up the genome, that makes someone, to have the albinism trait. But the people I've met who have it they get skin cancer really, really early, and they have a lot of other health problems. So it could actually be an issue if you didn't have protection. But at the same time, as I said, it is likely that these genes that are influencing skin color may have other effects. For example, we don't know this, but what if they somehow played a role in resistance to infectious disease, which kills a lot of people in Africa? Could that be one of the reasons that variants associated with dark skin arose? We don't know. It's a hypothesis that we're looking into. But one of the important points is that skin color has evolved over millions of years in Africa. And in our study of the genetics of skin color in many diverse Africans who have a wide range of pigmentation levels, that the variants that we found through that study, identified in Africans, found that there are variants associated with light skin and variants associated with dark skin. And many of them are old. Typically, they predate, in half the cases, the ancestral variant was the one associated with light skin, not dark skin. And many of these variants arose up to 1 million years ago, and they've been variable in African populations for at least 1 million years. Now, there are other variants that would have arisen independently in non-African populations, and there are other groups that are studying them. So the point is that skin color as an adaptive trait has been continuing to evolve in Africa and across the globe. And so there may be some different variants in different regions of the world, but certainly at these regions that we found, the variants associated with the light skin in Africa, they arose in Africa, and we now see them in Europeans and often in East Asians. But really interestingly to me, actually, was the observation that the variants associated with dark skin in these genes, the only other place we saw them outside of Africa was South Asia and Australo-Melanesia, 2 places where we see darkly pigmented skin. And we were actually able to trace the origin of these mutations. You can look for sharing of the chromosomal region around those variants. And we actually could trace it back to Africa. So that meant that these variants did not evolve independently in those regions. They must have been introduced when modern humans left Africa 50 to 80,000 years ago, and they migrated into these regions, and they were maintained in those regions because they're adaptive, and they were lost in other regions because perhaps they weren't adaptive.
That makes sense to me. So going back to the question that I raised, so some of these variants were already inside of the human genome 1 million years ago.
That's
in
correct.
other words, is it fair to say that then humans were going to have the possibility to adapt to their environment in order for the survival of the species?
Well, that's always the case. Yes, that all humans have the possibility to adapt. And this is random. Adaptation and evolution is a random process. It's, mutations just randomly by chance occur. If they happen to increase your fitness, and by fitness, we mean the number of children you have, the number of children they have. If that gets increased, that variant will rise to high frequency.
About what do you think, or what can you surmise from the research that was the level of pigmentation of the skin in the first Homo sapiens?
And with 1,600 people in the study, we found a number of regions of the genome that were playing a role in skin color. Many of them had never previously been known, and one of them, a gene called MFSD12, had never been characterized. We're the first people, if you do like a search for this gene, we're the first people to describe it. And we found it not knowing what it does because it had never been described. And one of the ways you can figure out what it does is you can actually knock out, we use something called gene editing, my collaborator at NIH did this, and he knocked out the gene in a mouse that was sort of a brown reddish color, and the mouse, the progeny of that mouse, completely different color. So they've lost the red color, and now they're sort of a underlying gray brown color. So that was really striking, where we could actually say we did this genetic association study in humans, then we knocked the gene out, this candidate gene in mice. It has a dramatic impact on pigmentation. So the point is, it was very hard to say anything about the origins of skin color in Africa if you're not studying African populations. That's been the problem. But what we're looking at are still relative, even if it's 1 million years. Our ancestors diverged from our closest genetic relatives, chimpanzees, at least 5 million years ago, may have been even closer to 8 million years ago. So that's a long time period of evolution of the hominin lineage. And the variants that we're looking at, we can just date back to, say, 1 million to 2 million years ago. But other people, other anthropologists, such as Nina Jablonski at Penn State University, have speculated that because many chimpanzees have relatively light colored skin, if you were to, remove the body hair, you'll see that many of them have lightly pigmented skin. And the idea was that if you have body hair, then there's not as much selection for dark pigmentation because you've got some protection. But millions of years ago, let's say at least 3 million years ago, when our ancestors would have left the forest environment and gone off into a savanna environment where there's very few trees, very few little protection, there would have been selection to lose the body hair, to have better thermoregulation. And then if you've lost the body hair, there will be selection for more darkly pigmented skin. But the issue is that people, when they think of Africa, they think dark skin. Everybody in Africa has dark skin, sort of like some homogeneous group. Africans are not a homogeneous group. They are incredibly genetically diverse. This is one of the things that my lab has shown over the past 20 years, that there's more diversity between some populations in a relatively small region of Africa than between Africans and East Asians, okay? They're a really, really diverse group, and this is because modern humans arose in Africa 300,000 years ago. They've maintained relatively big population sizes compared to Europeans. I'm not looking at today's census, but in the past. And they have migrated to different regions of Africa, and they've adapted to different environments. So you see this amazing amount of diversity in Africa. So they're not a homogeneous group. There's no such thing as an African race. This is a misconception. And when people, if you ask someone on the street, how do you define race? They're probably going to say skin color. It's actually a terrible classification of race because, as I pointed out, it's an adaptive trait, and you see darkly pigmented people in Africa and South Asia and Australasia. But they think of Africa as just some homogeneous, everybody's very darkly pigmented. And as I mentioned, there's a huge range of variation in Africa. So the people who speak a Khoisan language that has clicks, I'm not really able to do that very well, but we refer to them as the San for short. And they today live in Southern Africa. They traditionally practice hunting and gathering. And they have genetic lineages that are at the base of the human population tree. So what that means is that they are descended from a population ancestral to all other modern humans. Nice. They have the lightest skin in Africa. And then we see people who speak Nilo-Saharan languages. People might think, and they're often pastoralist groups, so they traditionally have cattle and they drink a lot of milk. This would be groups from South Sudan, for example. They have the most darkly pigmented skin in the world. And I believe that that very darkly pigmented skin is probably also an adaptation. the purpose for that, or the reason that this is an adaptation, we don't know yet. It's something we're trying to figure out, because as I said, I think that these genes that play a role in skin color could also play a role in other traits. So that's something we want to look into. But given the variation we see in Africa today, I don't see any reason that a million, 2 million, 3 million years ago, there wasn't also variation. And depending on where populations lived and what the selective pressures were, you could have seen a range of skin colors in Africa. And we also don't know what the skin color was of the ancestral populations that left Africa. We really don't know. If they were groups related to the San, possible they could have been relatively light-skinned, or they could have been related to the Nilo-Saharan people who were very darkly pigmented. So that's still an outstanding question. And outside of Africa, there are scientists who are looking at ancient DNA that they got from fossils. And what's really neat is they can actually look at genetic variants that have been shown to be correlated with skin color and look at the frequency of these variants over time. So they can look at fossils from 40,000 years to much more recent. What those seem to indicate is that 40,000 years ago, individuals were more darkly pigmented. And that the variants that we see today associated with very light skin are pretty recent. They may have been only in the past 2,000 years or so. And this is something people don't realize, that really lightly pigmented people like me, this may have only become common 2,000 years ago. That's not a very long time. And again, in Europe, there was probably variation for skin color as well. But one thing that is clear is that there are a few genes, SLC24A5 is one of them, that actually was the very first gene found to be associated with light skin color in Europeans. It was actually found in a fish originally, and the fish changed colors, and then they looked at it in humans, and they found, wow, this is correlated with skin color. But for example, that particular variant didn't become common until, as I said, the past 2,000 or 3,000 years, very, very recently. So you can have shifts in skin color pretty rapidly. And that particular variant, actually, what's interesting is that was also present in Africa. And it was present in Eastern Africans and in some of the Southern Africans that have a little bit lighter skin. And that was a big mystery. What is going on here? Here's this variant that's classically associated with light skin outside of Africa, and we're seeing it in East Africa and Southern Africa. In this particular case, it was, we believe, introduced back into Africa, that it may have actually evolved outside of Africa, was introduced back to Africa by people migrating, particularly into the Horn of Africa, into Ethiopia, for example, where we know that people in that region have a considerable amount of non-African ancestry due to this historic migration and intermarriage. And we think possibly due to selection, that gene, this variant in that gene, became common in some East African, some Southern African populations. So that's an example where it can go both ways. So sometimes we found variants that are associated with light skin that originated in Africa, and they were introduced into non-African populations where they now influenced skin color outside of Africa. And we have the reverse. We have something that arose outside of Africa and may have been introduced back into Africa, where it now influences skin color in Africa.
That how is it that we continue to use the idea of the man-made notion of race based on skin color, when that is simply an adaptive trait that will most likely continue to happen with the evolution of humans?
That's right. Skin color is a terrible classifier of race. And, part of the problem is that historically, it's a classifier that's been used for hundreds of years from some of the earliest people who actually started classifying so-called races. And the problem is that there's always been this mixture of people, when they try to classify race, using some biological traits like skin color, some other morphological traits, or maybe hair type or things like that. But race is fundamentally a social concept. And so they mix sort of the social and the biological so that it's completely confounded. And most of these biological traits that people think have, define race, they don't, because they are just adaptations to an environment They are seen in people across the world, and they will shift over time, and they can shift very rapidly. As I mentioned, these variants associated with very light skin could have just been in the past couple of thousand years in Northern Europe, for example, in Western Europe.
So it's an interesting notion to think that we continue to see race, for example, appear in the census, and it is nonsensical.
Yeah.
That we have not mine in particular. I am mixed peoples. I am an ethnographic mix, and why and how can I classify myself as a certain race? So how do we change that, Dr. Tishkoff? How do we change?
So there has actually been discussion, I know, at the National Academy of Sciences, that some people are interested in addressing that question, because one of the problems is when the US Census, for example, makes you check off a box and they say, what is your race? It reinforces a concept, a biological concept of race, which is, and also it may not be that informative, because maybe what you really don't want to know, maybe it's not race, maybe you want to know ethnicity, maybe you want to know where did their grandparents, the ancestry, their genetic ancestry, right? Where did their grandparents come from? So, my hope would be that people are going to move away from using race and either refer to, depending on the question, ancestry, ethnicity. It could be language, it could be, other factors. In the Latino community, for example, people may have differing amounts of African ancestry, Native American ancestry, European ancestry. It's really one of the worst racial classifiers that I can think of, because it just doesn't capture ancestry very well. I would say that I have been pursuing the question of African genetics and African population history for my entire academic career. And the skin color trait we started looking at, I believe, around, it's been so long now, I'm trying to think, but probably, mid to late 2000s, because we wanted to look at how people adapt to different environments. And that's a classic adaptive trait. So that was something we started looking at.
Well, we share that hope. We share that science can give us some degree of better understanding about how to coexist with humans, and that we are certainly one human race, and we need to take care of each other and be civil. So I think we're on the same page on that,
Yes.
one from art and one from science, but I think this is where they unite.
Right, exactly.
I can't thank you enough for your time and your efforts. Your lifelong efforts are in this small interview, but shedding light on the scientific light from a woman who wants to care, that cares deeply about humanity, and especially of Africa. I think it's time we all know more about Africa. But starting with the color of skin, I think that we can be a better understanding how to coexist in this human race a little bit more peacefully. And
I completely agree.
This is the piece that it all was based on.
Wow.
Because I did it in my studio, and I literally went to the computer and I Googled what is the provenance of white skin. Let me know what you think. Or
that's awesome.
Anything.
All right. Well,
so appreciate your time and trusting me. But I really believe that the more science talks outside, and that's why you're such a wonderful storyteller, that it was really worth telling.
Well, that's why I did it, frankly, because I knew that this would have a public outreach, and it's one of my goals to do sort of outreach to the public, to explain science and these concepts and things. So thank you for putting this together and for asking me.